Imagine standing in front of 500 elites while your billionaire husband grabs a microphone, announces your divorce, and calls you a worthless charity case. He smiled, thinking he'd just thrown his quiet wife out into the cold to protect his secret new fortune. He thought he was discarding a beggar, but he made one fatal billion-dollar mistake. He had absolutely no idea the woman he was publicly humiliating actually owned the company that just bought his entire empire. To see exactly how she completely dismantles his life without ever raising her voice, make sure you watch this story until the very last second. Before we dive in, please take a quick moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I absolutely love seeing how far our community reaches. Now, let the story begin. The clinking of baccarat crystal in the grand ballroom of the Sterling Legacy Gala was supposed to be a sound of unshakable triumph. 500 of the city's most formidable figures stood beneath vaulted ceilings dripping with gold leaf, celebrating a full century of the Sterling family's financial supremacy. It was an evening steeped in the heavy scent of rare orchids and old money. At the exact center of it all stood Richard Sterling, a man whose impeccably tailored tuxedo and silver fox charm were as carefully manufactured as his public smile. He tapped the silver spoon lightly against his champagne flute, and the sprawling room instantly fell into a practiced, admiring silence. He loved this part. He breathed it in. He loved the heavy weight of 1,000 powerful eyes resting squarely upon his shoulders. To his right stood his adult daughter, Victoria. She was a mirror image of her father's most ruthless traits, clad in a sleek, emerald gown, her eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory, expectant gleam. But it was a woman on Richard's left who truly anchored the scene, even if the glittering crowd had spent 15 years pretending she was invisible. Evelyn, his wife. She did not wear the heavy, ostentatious diamonds the Sterling women were historically known for. Her dress was a muted midnight blue, her posture impeccable, her expression a gentle, quiet thing. For a decade and a half, the society pages had dismissed her as Richard's dull charity case, a mild-mannered, uneducated woman from nowhere who had somehow managed to secure the city's most arrogant bachelor. She was the ghost of the Sterling Empire, always present, never heard. Richard adjusted the microphone stand, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build anticipation. The room leaned in, expecting the usual grand rhetoric about heritage, market dominance, and the future. Instead, Richard's polished smile morphed into something sharp, cold, and cruel. "A century of absolute success," he began, his deep voice echoing off the marble pillars, "requires knowing exactly when to cut the dead weight." The polite smiles among the governors, CEOs, and socialites began to falter. Richard turned slowly, abandoning the audience, and looked directly at his wife. "Tonight, we don't just celebrate 100 years of the Sterling name. We celebrate its purification. Effective as of this morning, I am filing for divorce, and Evelyn is being permanently removed from the family board." The collective inhale of 500 people pulled the oxygen straight out of the room. A suffocating, electric shock paralyzed the gala. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "You see," Richard continued, his voice dripping with theatrical, mocking pity, projecting effortlessly into dead silence, "a family of wolves cannot be led by a sheep. We brought a charity case into our home 15 years ago, hoping she might learn our ways. We gave her a roof, a name, and a life she never deserved. But you simply cannot teach a commoner how to wear a crown." Beside him, Victoria let out a soft, venomous laugh. She wasn't just smiling. She was savoring the public slaughter of the woman she had despised for years. Every single eye in that sprawling ballroom snapped to Evelyn. They expected her to crumble. They waited for the inevitable tears, the trembling hands, the desperate, pleading run toward the velvet-draped exits. But what happened next was a detail the elite of this city would whisper about in locked boardrooms for years to come. Evelyn did not flush with shame. Her breathing did not quicken. Slowly, with the deliberate, chilling grace of a predator, she reached out and set her champagne glass down on the edge of the nearest silver platter. The crystal base touched the metal without a single microscopic tremor. Not one drop of the golden liquid spilled. She looked at Richard and then at Victoria with eyes that were not broken, not humiliated, but terrifyingly, unfathomably calm. It was not the look of a woman who had just been thrown out of the castle. It was the look of a woman who held the deed to the land it was built on. The silence in the ballroom shattered, replaced instantly by the low, venomous hum of 500 whispers. High society is a world where blood is rarely spilled with a knife. It is drawn with words, rumors, and calculated public executions. Tonight, the elite had been served a masterpiece of cruelty. Guests leaned into one another behind crystal goblets, their eyes darting toward the woman standing perfectly still at the center of the spectacle. They traded quick, vicious theories. Some pitied her, most simply devoured the drama. Richard stood tall at the microphone, absorbing the shockwaves of his own arrogance like a man basking in sunlight. He genuinely believed he had just committed the perfect social murder. To understand the sheer, breathtaking malice of this moment, you must understand the reality of the Sterling household over the last 15 years. Behind the heavy oak doors of their private estate, Evelyn was never treated as a wife or mother figure. To Richard, she was a quiet prop, a convenient, mild-tempered accessory that made him appear grounded to his older investors. To Victoria, she was an uneducated nuisance, a peasant occupying space in a palace. Whenever Richard made a disastrous market gamble, and he made many, he would casually leak to the board that Evelyn's overly conservative anxieties were holding his visionary genius back. Whenever Victoria hemorrhaged company funds on flashy, doomed acquisitions, she blamed her stepmother's lack of sophisticated vision. They used her as a perpetual scapegoat, a silent sponge to their own staggering incompetence. And Evelyn had let them. She had absorbed the blame, the mockery, and the condescension without a single word of defense. But why tonight? Why humiliate her with such theatrical venom in front of the most powerful people in the city? The answer, as it always is with men like Richard, was greed born of profound desperation. The glittering facade of the Sterling Empire was a lie. The company was bleeding out, crippled by years of Richard's hollow vanity projects and Victoria's insatiable spending. They were weeks away from a catastrophic, highly public bankruptcy. That was until a miraculous lifeline appeared. A massive, anonymous private equity firm had recently approached them, offering a staggering multi-billion-dollar buyout that would not only erase their massive debts, but flood their personal accounts with unimaginable liquid wealth. Richard and Victoria had spent the last month orchestrating this secret deal in the shadows. In their minds, they were about to be minted as legends of the financial world, and they were absolutely damned if they were going to let the quiet, unassuming woman they despised claim half of that impending fortune in a standard marital settlement. They needed to force her out tonight, aggressively and publicly, triggering a brutal exclusion clause they had buried in the family trust. They thought they were being exceptionally clever. They thought they had secured their empire, shed their dead weight, and walked away with the royal treasury. They were celebrating a victory they had not actually won. As Richard grinned at his daughter, sharing a silent, congratulatory look over the ruins of his marriage, he remained blissfully ignorant of a fatal detail. He had spent his entire life assuming that quiet people were inherently stupid. He never once bothered to investigate the heavy, suffocating fine print of the buyout contract he had so eagerly signed to save his own skin. He did not know that the massive windfall he was salivating over was a mirage. The Sterling patriarch believed he had just tossed a beggar out into the freezing cold. He had absolutely no idea that he had just stepped blindly into a meticulously designed snare. The crowd parted like shallow water as Victoria descended the steps from the main dais, her emerald gown catching the harsh glare of the chandeliers. She moved with the predatory confidence of a victor coming to collect the spoils, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. In her manicured hand, she held a crisp, folded piece of paper. The murmurs in the room fell into a breathless hush as she stopped inches from her stepmother. With a smirk that barely masked her disdain, Victoria extended her arm, pressing the document toward Evelyn's small clutch. It was a cashier's check, a pre-signed, insulting severance, a final tip for 15 years of quiet servitude. "Take it," Victoria murmured, her voice a silk-wrapped blade designed to carry only to the front row. "There's a service elevator down the east corridor. If you leave right now, through the back door, you might still retain a shred of dignity. Don't make a scene, Evelyn." Before Evelyn could even look at the slip of paper, a shadow shifted at the edge of the confrontation. From the perimeter of the catering staff, a figure broke protocol. It was Thomas, an elderly, silver-haired headwaiter who had worked the Sterling galas for 3 decades. He possessed the dignified posture of a man who had seen generations of arrogant wealth rise and fall. Thomas knew the real Evelyn. He was the man who had watched her quietly pay for the kitchen staff's medical bills while the rest of the family treated them like furniture. Thomas stepped smoothly between the heiress and the outcast. With deliberate grace, he reached past Victoria and picked up the champagne glass Evelyn had placed on the platter. He polished the base with a pristine napkin, set it back down at Evelyn's fingertips, and refused to clear her placement. Leaning in, he spoke softly, his weathered voice vibrating with profound respect. "Your glass is still full, madam, and you always hold the room beautifully." The audacity of a servant interrupting threw Victoria off balance. Her jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with indignation. "Excuse me," she snapped, turning her venom toward the old man. "You are dismissed." But Evelyn finally moved. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing Thomas's forearm in a gesture of profound gratitude. A genuine warmth briefly thawed the terrifying calm in her eyes. Thomas offered a knowing bow and stepped back, leaving the two women facing each other in a heavy, expectant silence. Evelyn looked down at the check trembling slightly in Victoria's hand. She did not take it. Instead, the warmth in her expression vanished, replaced instantly by an icy authority that pinned her stepdaughter to the floor. When Evelyn finally spoke her first words of the evening, her voice was not the subservient whisper the family knew. It was resonant, steady, and chilled to zero. "Put your money away, Victoria," she said softly, the words carrying cleanly across the dead quiet of the room. "You are going to need every single cent of it." Victoria blinked, a sudden flicker of absolute confusion piercing her practiced arrogance. Evelyn stepped a fraction of an inch closer, her presence suddenly commanding all the air around them. "You and your father were in such a desperate rush to lock me out of the estate, you forgot to check who actually holds the deed. The ink on that massive bailout contract your father signed this morning is already perfectly dry, and you have absolutely no idea what you have done. To understand the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of the mistake Richard and Victoria had just made, you must look far beyond the marble floors of the Sterling Gala. You have to go back 30 years, to a cramped, dimly lit apartment where a young girl sat across a laminate kitchen table from her father. He was a forensic accountant, a quiet, meticulous man who spent his entire life sifting through the financial wreckage of arrogant men. He did not leave Evelyn a sprawling trust fund, nor did he introduce her to high society connections. What he left her was a singular, unbreakable philosophy. He taught her how to read the hidden language of ledgers, proving to her night after night that the loudest people in the room are almost always the most desperately in debt. He told her that true power never shouts. It watches. It calculates. He taught her that loud money is usually broke, and true wealth is entirely invisible. Evelyn internalized that lesson deep within her marrow. While other young women her age were busy chasing the hollow validation of social status, she was teaching herself the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of corporate restructuring. She did not inherit a single dime. Every ounce of her empire was forged in the exhausting, profoundly lonely hours long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. For years, she survived on cheap coffee and sheer, terrifying discipline, devouring balance sheets and identifying the fatal weaknesses in bloated companies. She began making small, hyper-calculated investments, turning failing assets into quiet fortunes. And as her capital steadily grew into something monstrous, something that heavily rivaled the old money dynasties of the city, she made a deliberate, strategic choice. She would not put her name on the door. She understood that ego was a gravity that eventually pulled all great empires into the dirt. Instead, she created a ghost. She structured a vast, labyrinthine private equity firm entirely behind layers of impenetrable corporate shielding. She named it Apex Holdings. Within a few short years, the corporate world felt its sheer gravitational pull. Apex Holdings swallowed failing conglomerates, ruthlessly restructured insurmountable debt, and commanded the terrified respect of Wall Street's most vicious predators. Yet, nobody knew the face of its architect. The financial industry naturally assumed the firm was run by a syndicate of ruthless, aggressive men. They never once suspected that the apex predator dominating their global markets was a soft-spoken woman, who preferred tending to her garden over cutting velvet ribbons at charity balls. She spent a decade and a half perfectly camouflaged. When she married Richard, the elite society of the city looked at her unadorned dresses in polite silence and saw a vacant, unremarkable charity case. They pitied her. They assumed she was deeply fortunate just to be allowed inside their gilded cages. They had no idea they were casually tossing scraps to a dormant volcano. Every time Richard belittled her intelligence, every time Victoria mocked her lack of sophisticated vision, Evelyn simply absorbed it, entirely untouched by their pathetic vanity. Because a woman who quietly commands tens of billions of dollars in the shadows does not need the applause of a bleeding company's patriarch. She had spent her entire life mastering the absolute art of being underestimated. The high society that pitted the quiet wife had fundamentally failed to realize that the meek do not inherit the earth. They simply buy it from the arrogant while everyone else is busy talking. For 15 years, the sterling marriage was a meticulously curated illusion. Richard viewed himself as a benevolent monarch who had stooped down to lift a commoner from obscurity. He paraded Evelyn at fundraisers and corporate dinners not as an equal partner, but as a living testament to his own magnanimity. He delighted in casually talking over her, gently patting her hand while he explained basic economic principles to her in front of his amused colleagues. Victoria was even less subtle in her cruelty. She treated Evelyn like a temporary guest who had vastly overstayed her welcome, intentionally leaving her off important family correspondence, and rolling her eyes whenever Evelyn dared to suggest a conservative approach to the company's aggressive, reckless expansions. They were deeply convinced of their own towering intellect, utterly blind to the fact that their grand empire was a hollow shell rotting from the inside out. What neither Richard nor his ruthless daughter ever understood was that Evelyn was the only load-bearing pillar, keeping the roof from crushing them. When the gala lights dimmed and the estate grew quiet, the docile wife vanished, replaced by the phantom architect, while Richard slept in the master suite, dreaming of his own brilliance. Evelyn would slip into mahogany study at 3 a.m. With a few keystrokes on a secured server, she would silently restructure the catastrophic debt he had accrued that quarter. When Victoria blindly dumped millions into doomed tech startups, Evelyn secretly routed capital through dummy corporations to artificially inflate the stock just long enough for the sterlings to sell before the inevitable crash. Evelyn patched the leaking hull of their legacy month after month, year after year, never once taking credit, never once leaving a single fingerprint. The tragedy of her silence was rooted in profound, aching loneliness. Evelyn had spent her youth building an empire entirely alone. She had conquered the financial world, but she had done it in a solitary vacuum. When she married Richard, she desperately wanted a real family. She wanted to believe that if she hid her staggering wealth, they might learn to love her simply for her character. She allowed them to play the role of business geniuses, enduring their daily condescension and arrogant mockery, hoping that underneath the polished venom, there was capacity for genuine warmth. She built an invisible fortress around their fragile egos, protecting them from the brutal consequences of their own incompetence, simply because she wanted a place to belong. But 15 years of ungrateful cruelty is a heavy burden for any soul to carry. Eventually, the tender hope began to calcify. She watched Richard take credit for financial miracles he fundamentally did not understand. She listened to Victoria sneer at her intelligence while spending money Evelyn had secretly injected into their failing trusts. A melancholic realization settled deeply into Evelyn's bones. They did not want a family member. They wanted a punching bag. The warmth she had guarded so fiercely finally went cold. The psychological shift was invisible, yet absolute. She realized that by constantly protecting them from ruin, she had only enabled their tyranny. The time for silent charity had ended. She stopped patching the leaks. She stepped back, folded her hands in the shadows, and decided to let the ocean rush in. As she stood on the gala floor, looking into the eyes of the man who thought he had just discarded her, the pain of her long patience was entirely gone. In its place was a quiet, righteous anticipation. The illusion of the king was about to shatter, and she was finally going to let him feel the full, crushing weight of the crown. The sheer scale of catastrophe looming over the Sterling family had been carefully hidden from the gala's glittering attendees. Just 72 hours earlier, the empire was bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. The major banks had finally stopped returning Richard's panic phone calls. Ruthless creditors were quietly preparing to dismantle a full century of legacy and sell it off as scrap. The grand illusion of their invincibility was mere days away from a brutal, highly public execution. Richard spent those sleepless nights pacing his velvet-lined study, sweating through his bespoke dress shirts, terrified not of losing his thousands of employees' livelihoods, but of losing the only thing that actually mattered to him, his pristine, aristocratic image. He was a drowning man searching desperately for any floating debris to cling to. He needed a miracle, and he needed it before the end of the fiscal week. That miracle materialized in the form of a sleek, heavy dossier from Apex Holdings. The faceless private equity giant approached the sterling board with a lifeline so massive it felt like divine intervention. The terms, however, were notoriously predatory. The proposed contract offered absolute debt erasure and a staggering injection of liquid capital, but it demanded an extortionate price in return: the immediate surrender of 100% of the Sterling family's executive voting rights. To any competent businessman, this was not a rescue. It was a total capitulation, a hostile takeover wrapped in a velvet bow. But Richard was not a competent businessman. He was an egomaniac blinded by sheer panic. He looked at the astronomical figures, saw his salvation, and convinced himself he was simply executing a masterful, high-level corporate maneuver that his peers were too timid to attempt. Victoria, equally infected by toxic arrogance, pushed her father to close the deal instantly, but they shared one final, venomous objective before the ink could touch the paper. They were absolutely determined to ensure that Evelyn, the quiet, useless wife, would not legally benefit from the massive influx of incoming capital. They orchestrated the brutal public divorce specifically for tonight, to legally sever her from the marital assets mere hours after the restructuring was finalized. At 9 o'clock that very morning, locked inside a sterile, glass-walled conference room, Richard and Victoria eagerly signed away the entire Sterling legacy. They enthusiastically initialed every draconian clause, completely surrendering total control of the company. In their manic rush to secure the money and finalize Evelyn's brutal ousting, neither of them bothered to demand the unredacted disclosure of Apex Holdings' ultimate beneficial owner. That singular, catastrophic oversight was a trap, springing shut. The dramatic irony of the evening was now a suffocating weight. As Richard stood under the chandeliers, basking the applause of his cruel announcement, the terrible truth of the situation was finally coming into focus. He firmly believed he was holding a masterful winning hand, aggressively discarding the weakest card in his deck. He had absolutely no comprehension that the woman standing silently before him, the woman he was currently humiliating for the entertainment of high society, was the sole architect of his salvation and his ruin. They had spent the morning enthusiastically handing the absolute keys to their kingdom to the exact person they were trying to destroy. The villains had not just dug their own graves. They had polished the shovels and cheerfully handed them to the quiet woman holding the deed to the cemetery. The tension in the ballroom hung, so thick it threatened to crack the crystal chandeliers. Richard stared down from the dais, his polished, silver fox smile beginning to fray at the edges. This was not the script he had written in his head. In his meticulously crafted fantasy, the announcement of the divorce was supposed to break his wife instantly. He had anticipated tears, a humiliating public plea, or at the very least, a panic retreat through the crowd. Instead, Evelyn remained rooted to the polished marble floor, her posture perfectly aligned, her face a mask of terrifying serenity. Her cryptic warning to Victoria about the ink being dry had not struck fear into him. It had only ignited a sharp, defensive irritation. He despised her composure. He despised that even in her public execution, she refused to give him the satisfaction of a total surrender. Snatching the microphone back from the silver stand, Richard decided to accelerate the finale. If she would not run, she would be dragged. "It appears," his voice boomed, adopting a tone of patronizing fatigue, "that some people require a bit more clarity when their time has expired. Security, please escort my former wife off my property." A ripple of nervous energy swept through the 500 guests as two broad-shouldered men in dark suits began to navigate the perimeter of the room. But Richard was not finished. He needed to reassert his dominance, to remind the city's elite exactly why the Sterling name was untouchable. He needed to bask in the blinding glow of his own supposed genius. Let this evening not be marred by the unpleasant necessities of pruning a family tree, Richard projected, extending his free arm wide, as if embracing the entire room. Today marks the dawn of a new century for our empire. Just this morning, I personally closed a historic restructuring agreement with Apex Holdings. It is a monumental partnership, one that completely eradicates our minor liabilities and injects an unprecedented level of capital into our operations. The Sterling legacy is no longer just secure, it is absolutely immortal. We are untouchable. Victoria beamed beside him, her emerald gown glittering as she absorbed the awe radiating from the crowd. They were kings of the mountain, untouchable titans who had just secured their golden throne for another 100 years. Down on the floor, the two security guards stopped a few feet from Evelyn, suddenly hesitant to lay hands on a woman radiating such cold, unyielding authority. She did not even acknowledge their presence. While Richard bellowed his triumphant speech, while Victoria smirked, while the high society vultures murmured their impressed congratulations, Evelyn simply raised her left wrist. The gesture was small, casual, and utterly devastating in its nonchalance. She looked at the slender face of her watch, the gold hands ticking steadily toward the exact top of the hour. The fuse had burned all the way down to the base. She lowered her arm just as a deep, resonant thud echoed from the back of the grand ballroom. The sound was heavy enough to cut cleanly through Richard's amplified boasting. Every head in the room, all 500 members of the city's elite, turned in absolute unison. At the far end of the hall, the massive 12-foot mahogany doors, the very doors Victoria had sneeringly suggested Evelyn use for a quiet escape, were unlatching. They swung open slowly, the heavy brass hinges groaning against the sudden, breathless silence of the room. The air in the ballroom seemed to completely evaporate. The drop had finally arrived. Through the widening gap of the heavy mahogany doors stepped 5 men and 2 women, moving in a synchronized, impenetrable formation. They wore immaculate, bespoke charcoal suits, exuding the kind of cold, lethal professionalism that only exists at the absolute pinnacle of global finance. At their center walked Marcus Vance, the lead senior counsel for Apex Holdings, a man whose mere presence in a boardroom usually meant an empire was about to change hands. His face was a mask of chiseled flint. The moment Richard recognized the Apex legal team, a surge of ecstatic, blinding arrogance washed over his features. He genuinely believed they had arrived to publicly validate his genius, to crown him before the city's elite. It was the ultimate victory lap. Richard abandoned the microphone and practically glided down the marble staircase, smoothing his tuxedo jacket with practiced, predatory elegance. Victoria flanked him, her smirk returning in full force as she prepared to bask in the blinding glow of their newly secured wealth. Richard's voice boomed across the silent ballroom, dripping with forced camaraderie as he extended a manicured hand. He stepped directly into the center aisle to intercept the approaching attorneys, ready to welcome his saviors. Marcus Vance did not break his stride. He did not extend his hand. He did not so much as blink, as Richard stood there with his arm outstretched, wearing a desperate, frozen smile. The most powerful attorney in the financial sector walked right past him. It was not a simple slight. It was a total erasure. Marcus moved past the sterling patriarch as though Richard were nothing more than a decorative statue in a dusty foyer. A collective, strangled gasp rippled to the 500 guests. Richard's arm dropped slowly to his side, the healthy color instantly draining from his face as his monumental ego collided with sudden, creeping terror. Marcus continued his deliberate march across the polished floor, heading straight for the woman standing quietly by the catering tables. The 2 broad-shouldered security guards, sensing a shift in gravity they did not fully understand, instinctively backed away. Marcus stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Evelyn. The entire ballroom held its breath, trapped in the amber of this impossible moment. Then Marcus Vance, a man who dictated crushing terms to sovereign nations and dismantled corporate dynasties before breakfast, lowered his shoulders and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, absolute reverence. From inside his tailored jacket, Marcus produced a heavy, leather-bound folio. He opened it with careful precision, revealing a thick stack of watermarked vellum. Resting squarely on top was a master deed to the Sterling ancestral estate. He extended it toward Evelyn with both hands. Evelyn did not snatch it. She simply rested her fingertips on the leather cover, her expression remaining terrifyingly calm. Marcus then turned his back on Evelyn, facing the paralyzed crowd and the trembling Sterling patriarch. He did not need a microphone. His voice possessed the sharp, cutting resonance of an executioner's blade. He looked directly at Richard. He explained that there had been a fatal misconception regarding the nature of the morning's transaction. Apex Holdings had no partners. They did not rescue sinking ships. They acquired them in their entirety. Marcus paused, letting the heavy silence press down on Richard's suffocating lungs. Then, with devastating clarity, he formally introduced the room to the sole founder, the absolute majority shareholder and the definitive owner of Apex Holdings. He gestured to Evelyn. The words fell into the room like an anvil. The ultimate catharsis washed over the frozen gala. In a matter of seconds, the arrogant king and his ruthless daughter were reduced to ash, utterly outmatched and completely powerless. They realized, with crushing certainty, that the quiet woman they had just thrown to the wolves was the absolute master of the pack. The silence that followed Marcus Vance's declaration was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of a collapsing star. Richard stood frozen in the center aisle, his mouth parting slightly, though his lungs seemed to have forgotten how to draw air. The polished, silver fox patriarch had vanished, replaced instantly by a hollow, terrified old man staring into the absolute abyss of his own ruin. Beside him, the predatory smirk had been completely wiped from Victoria's face. She looked as though all the blood in her veins had abruptly turned to ice. She stared at the leather folio in Evelyn's hands as if it were a venomous serpent preparing to strike. They were desperately waiting for the punchline, for Marcus to smile and declare it all a tasteless theatrical joke. But there were no smiles to be found. Evelyn took a single step forward, and the entire ballroom instinctively leaned back, deferring to the sudden, undeniable gravity of true power. When she finally spoke, she did not raise her voice. She did not scream, nor did she hurl the bitter insults she had quietly absorbed for 15 years. Her tone was terrifyingly gentle, carrying the surgical precision of a scalpel cutting through diseased tissue. "You are looking for someone to blame, Richard," she said softly, her words resonating flawlessly across the breathless crowd. "But you will not find a thief in this room. I did not steal your empire. I did not orchestrate a hostile coup in the shadows. I simply offered you a mirror, and you fell in love with your own reflection." Richard swallowed hard, a trembling hand rising halfway to his chest before falling uselessly to his side. "This is illegal," he managed to whisper, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its former booming authority. "You cannot just take my company." "I took nothing," Evelyn corrected him, her eyes locking onto his with absolute, devastating pity. "You gave it to me. Just this morning, you and your daughter were in such a desperate, ravenous hurry to secure a bailout and lock me out of my marital share that you signed a blind contract. You legally surrendered 100% of your executive voting rights in exchange for debt erasure. You traded your entire century of legacy for a parachute, Richard, without ever bothering to look up and see who was flying the plane." She turned her gaze to Victoria, whose hands were now visibly shaking against the expensive silk of her emerald gown. "And as the absolute majority owner of Apex Holdings, which now fully absorbs the Sterling estate, my first administrative duty is corporate restructuring." Evelyn handed the master deed back to Marcus without breaking eye contact with her stepdaughter. "Effective immediately, Richard, your position as CEO is terminated. Victoria, your seat on the board is dissolved entirely. Furthermore, the ancestral home you so proudly boasted about falls under the asset acquisition clause you eagerly initialed on page 42. The high society guests, the very people who had quietly chuckled at Richard's cruel jokes mere minutes ago, physically began to step away from the father and daughter. The elite operated entirely on the scent of power, and they could smell the rapid decay of the Sterling name filling the room. Richard and Victoria were suddenly isolated, marooned on a tiny island of polished marble. They had spent the entire evening attempting to humiliate a beggar, utterly blind to the fact that they were the ones standing in borrowed clothes, waiting for a charity they no longer deserved. Evelyn simply looked at them, her surgical dismantling complete, requiring absolutely no venom to finish the kill. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom did not slam shut behind Richard and Victoria. They simply swung quietly on their well-oiled hinges, closing with a soft, definitive click that signaled the absolute end of an era. The two figures stepped out into the biting chill of the midnight air with nothing but the expensive clothes on their backs. There was no severance package to ease their fall, no hidden safety net buried in an offshore trust fund, and no fleet of private town cars waiting at the curb. The sterling patriarch, a man who had spent his entire life measuring his worth by the volume of his applause, was suddenly greeted by the vast, indifferent silence of the city. They walked down the grand marble steps of the venue they no longer owned, their loud arrogance permanently extinguished by a quiet, unyielding competence they had completely failed to recognize. Back inside the glittering ballroom, the aftermath was not a scene of chaotic celebration. There was no gloating, no triumphant boasting from the woman who had just rewritten the financial landscape of the entire city. The 500 members of the elite did not whisper their usual venomous gossip. Instead, they stood in a state of profound, recalibrated awe. They watched as Evelyn politely thanked her legal counsel, picked up her champagne glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. She did not raise it to the room. She required no validation from the people who had spent a decade and a half pretending she was invisible. The high society of the city finally understood the new world order. They realized that true power does not demand attention. It commands reality. In the weeks and months that followed, Evelyn did not move into the lavish corner office of the sterling skyscraper. She did not give gloating interviews to financial magazines or parade her staggering victory across the social pages. She simply went home. She returned to the quiet, dignified life she had always preferred, tending to her modest garden and managing her colossal empire from the absolute peace of her private study. She was no longer a ghost haunting the halls of an arrogant king, nor was she the silent sponge for a toxic family's relentless failures. She was the architect, fully realized and completely free, shaping the global markets with the same steady, unseen hand she had always possessed. There is a profound lesson buried in the cold ashes of the Sterling Empire, one that the world forgets entirely too often. We are constantly conditioned to believe that strength is loud. We are taught to fear the people who shout the loudest, who pound their fists on boardroom tables, and who wear their arrogance like a heavy suit of armor. But arrogance is never a substitute for true competence. The loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest, desperately trying to drown out the terrifying silence of their own inadequacy. Never make the fatal mistake of confusing a quiet demeanor with an empty mind. The most dangerous people on this earth are not the ones who announce their arrival. They are the ones who build their kingdoms in silence while everyone else is busy talking. If you found yourself holding your breath as the unseen architect finally revealed her masterpiece, and if you believe that true dignity always outlasts loud cruelty, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone who might be quietly building their own empire in the shadows, waiting for their rightful moment. Tell me in the comment below, have you ever been severely underestimated, only to let your quiet success speak entirely for itself? I look forward to reading your stories. I will see you in the next one.